Every morning, my drive to work follows the same winding path, a familiar stretch of road that has become like a ritual. Among the usual sights, tree-lined streets, weathered houses, and passing cars, there is one that always catches my eye. An old, abandoned bridge, half hidden by weeds and shadows, slumping against the landscape like it's forgotten by everyone but me. The bridge sits a bit off the main road, its concrete cracked and vines winding around its pillars, making it look more like a relic from another time than part of the route. I never thought much about it beyond a fleeting curiosity, a question here and there about what purpose it once served, or why no one seemed to care about its state of decay. Sometimes I'd pass it and get this odd feeling, a kind of chill that ran down my spine as I glanced at its crumbling structure. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, it was just a bridge, old, abandoned, and unremarkable. But there was something about it that drew me, even if only briefly, each day as I drove by. I'd find myself staring for a second longer than I should, half expecting to see something move or hear the creak of its old bones in the wind. I never did, of course. It was always still, silent, blending back into the background as I passed it by. One morning after a heavy storm, I took my usual route, only to find the road littered with debris. Branches lay scattered across the asphalt, and pools of water reflected the dull gray sky, still dripping from the branches overhead. As I neared the bridge, I saw that the storm had left its mark there as well. The bridge looked different, broken in a way that seemed almost deliberate. Part of the structure had collapsed, revealing a lower section beneath the surface that I hadn't noticed before. It was as if the storm had peeled back a layer, exposing something hidden. I slowed down, curiosity taking over as I pulled off to the side of the road. From where I stood, I could see an entrance, a narrow opening that looked like the mouth of a cave, half covered in shadows. It was there, just below the remains of the bridge, like an invitation left behind by the storm itself. Against my better judgment, I felt an urge to get a closer look. My curiosity, dormant and patient for so long, seemed to surge forward, drawing me toward that dark, mysterious passageway. The descent wasn't easy. I had to climb down an embankment, slipping on the wet ground as I made my way toward the entrance. My hands grazed the damp earth, and the smell of wet soil filled my nose, a pungent reminder of the storm's aftermath. When I reached the opening, I found a narrow stairway leading down, a set of stone steps slick with moisture descending into darkness. Each step felt colder than the last, as though I was walking into another world, one far removed from the familiar warmth of daylight. The air grew heavier, thicker, the further I went, and the only sound was the faint echo of my footsteps reverberating off the walls. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. It was as if something was pulling me down, urging me to discover whatever lay beneath. When I finally reached the bottom, the world above felt distant, like a fading memory. The passage ahead was dark, stretching out into shadows that seemed to deepen with each step I took. The faint trickle of water echoed in the silence, and the ground was damp, each footfall leaving a faint impression in the mud. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward, into the unknown depths of the tunnel. Chapter 4: The Underground Passage. The tunnel stretched on, a long, winding corridor that seemed to breathe around me. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling in shallow puddles along the floor, casting distorted reflections of the faint light that filtered in from somewhere above. The walls were rough, worn down by time and moisture, and every step I took echoed, amplifying the sense of isolation that surrounded me. As I walked, a strange sense of dread began to creep in, an instinctual feeling that gnawed at me with each step forward. The air was thick with dampness, carrying a faint, metallic smell that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of my footsteps, the only sound in that suffocating silence. But as I moved further in, the tunnel seemed to change. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, pressing in from all sides. My footsteps sounded muffled now, as though the ground itself was swallowing the noise, leaving only a hollow silence in its wake. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a noise, distant but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. It was a screech, sharp and unnatural, reverberating through the darkness like the cry of something not quite human. The sound froze me in place, my breath catching as the noise echoed again, louder this time, filling the tunnel with its piercing tone. I didn't wait to hear it a third time. My body reacted before my mind could process, turning on my heel as I bolted back the way I came, my footsteps slipping on the wet ground as I raced back to the stairs. The tunnel seemed to stretch out forever as I sprinted, my footsteps a frantic echo against the dripping walls. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, each beat sinking with my desperate breaths. But above all that noise, I could still hear the screech, a terrible grating sound that echoed and rebounded off the tunnel walls, filling the space with a sound that defied logic. It wasn't the wind or metal scraping. It was alive, raw and unfiltered, like the howl of something I couldn't see, but that I knew was there. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever was making that sound. But the darkness seemed to close in around me, each step more disorienting than the last. The screech pierced the silence again, louder, as though whatever it was had drawn closer. I didn't dare look back. The idea of seeing anything behind me was more terrifying than the unknown in front of me. I could feel the slickness of the floor under my shoes, the cold water splashing as I stumbled forward. The sound echoed again, but this time it seemed sharper, more desperate, like a call. No, like a warning. I felt something deep within me snap, pushing me faster than I thought possible, my legs burning as I ran. I didn't know how close it was, and I didn't want to find out. All I knew was that I had to reach those stairs and get out of this place. When I finally saw the faint outline of the staircase in the distance, relief washed over me. But I could still hear the screech echoing behind me, filling the air with a sound that seemed to scrape against the very walls of the tunnel. I pushed forward, slipping and sliding as I raced up the steps, barely able to keep my footing on the wet stone. Every step felt like a battle, the weight of fear pressing down on me with each passing second. The screech grew louder, now so close that it felt like it was right behind me. I didn't dare turn around, focusing instead on the steps, counting each one as if that would somehow bring me closer to safety. The daylight at the top seemed so far away, a distant hope that I clung to as I climbed. The sound was relentless, a high-pitched, grating noise that felt as though it was piercing through my very thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with a terror I couldn't shake. Finally, I broke free from the stairwell, stumbling out into the open air, gasping as the daylight hit me. I half expected to feel something grab me, to hear the screech right beside me. But as I turned to look back, there was nothing, only the dark entrance below, silent and still. The sound had vanished as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only an oppressive silence that felt even heavier than the noise. I stood there for a moment, my breaths coming in sharp gasps, heart pounding as I looked back at the stairway. The sunlight felt strange, almost unreal after the darkness below, and I struggled to ground myself, to shake the feeling that something was still watching. The world around me felt muted, as though I was seeing it through a filter, colors dull and sounds distant. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something emerging from the entrance, some dark shape that would confirm everything I'd felt down there. But there was nothing, only the broken bridge, the wet ground, and the silence of the morning. I took a step back, then another, not daring to look away from the entrance until I was far enough away to feel the faintest sense of safety. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, to understand the source of that terrible sound. But there was no explanation, only the certainty that I had come too close to something I was never meant to encounter. When I finally turned away, I felt a chill run down my spine, a lingering sense of dread that stayed with me as I walked back to my car. The familiar sights of my route home felt different now, tainted by the memory of the tunnel, the screech, and the darkness that seemed to cling to me like a shadow. Every glance back felt like a confirmation that I had escaped, yet the fear lingered, refusing to let me go. I never took that route again. From that day forward, I went out of my way to avoid the broken bridge, adding extra miles to my commute just to keep it out of sight. It started as an ordinary drive, nothing out of the usual. The air was thick with that quiet, comforting hum of the road beneath my tires. I had planned the route ahead, checked the map, and was ready for a simple evening drive. I remember noticing the car behind me in my rearview mirror at first, just a subtle glance while I adjusted my position in the seat. It wasn't unusual to have someone behind me. We all share the road, after all. But something about this car, it just sat there, neither speeding up nor falling back, like it was locked in with me. I shrugged it off at first, but after a few minutes, I noticed the car had stuck with me through every minor turn and lane shift. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I thought. People often end up taking similar routes, even if it feels like they're following you. But then I made a quick lane change, thinking I'd be rid of it. And there it was, just as before, maintaining the exact same distance as if nothing had changed. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, a bead of sweat forming despite the cool air blowing through the vents. I took a deep breath, trying to settle the rising feeling of unease building in my chest. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the doubt was there, creeping in, relentless. The road stretched ahead, familiar yet eerie in its quietness. The streetlights cast long shadows that flickered in and out, and I found myself glancing into the mirror every few seconds, catching glimpses of those headlights. Every time I thought the car might finally veer off in another direction, it would mimic my path perfectly, like it was waiting on me, watching. I thought of every possible reason for someone to follow like this, but none of them made sense. I'd tried different roads, detours that barely made sense, even quick jerks of the steering wheel to test my suspicion. No matter what I did, the car was right there, like an uninvited shadow, glued to my every movement. The whole thing was becoming stranger with every turn, each street blending into the next, a never-ending stretch of road that only deepened my sense of unease. That's when I realized that I couldn't shake them off. It didn't matter how random my route or how fast I drove, they matched my pace, my turns, and even the smallest lane shifts. My stomach twisted at the thought. What if it wasn't just coincidence? What if someone was deliberately keeping up with me? I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the thought, but it clung stubbornly, digging deeper into my mind. My heart was pounding by now, faster than I could control. The feeling in the pit of my stomach was beyond nerves. It was raw, electric fear. Every move I made, they mirrored, and I found myself gripping the wheel, trying to come up with a plan, any plan, to shake them off. But nothing worked. I tried weaving through cars, speeding up to reckless speeds, then slowing down suddenly, hoping to confuse them. But every single move was matched precisely, as though they could anticipate my every thought. My hands were slick with sweat, and my pulse hammered in my ears. The car stayed back, never too close, never too far, just there, watching. My breath came in short bursts, my vision narrowing on the road ahead as if I was racing against something invisible, something relentless. The engine hummed under my foot as I pushed it harder, desperate to gain some ground, but they never let up. No one else on the road seemed to notice anything unusual. It was just me and this unseen stranger, locked in a silent game that I didn't understand. With every turn, I was losing hope. There was no plan, no exit that I could see. I was running out of moves, and a part of me began to wonder if this was some kind of sick game. The world around me felt smaller, like it was closing in, forcing me to keep moving but never allowing me to escape. The car behind seemed patient, almost as if they knew that, eventually, I would run out of road. At some point, I stopped trying to make sense of it. My focus shifted to survival, to finding any way out of this nightmare. But there was no relief, no escape from the car behind me, looming like a persistent shadow that refused to fade. I drove through winding streets and open stretches, past buildings, fields, and forgotten places I didn't recognize, hoping something might change. Yet each time I glanced back, they were there, unwavering, a silent figure that followed like a hunter waiting for the right moment. In a desperate attempt, I thought about pulling over, wondering if I could somehow confront this person. But the thought froze in my mind, and I realized I didn't want to face them. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, it was better unknown, better left in the shadows. My heart raced, my breath shallow, as I scanned the road for anything, anyone who could help. But the night was empty, silent, and indifferent to my panic. It was as though time had stopped, trapping me in this endless drive with no destination, only the knowledge that someone was out there, mirroring me, anticipating every movement. In that endless stretch of road, my hope of escape had turned to desperation, a helplessness I hadn't felt before. Each second stretched, and with each beat of my heart, I felt the weight of their silent pursuit growing. A presence I couldn't shake, no matter how far or fast I drove. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my car started to stutter. The engine hiccuped, a sharp shudder running through the frame of the car as it slowed, like it was resisting my foot on the gas pedal. I felt a pang of dread, the kind that twists in your gut, unmistakable and irreversible. This was the last thing I needed, a mechanical failure right when I was desperate to keep moving. I pressed harder on the gas, hoping to push past whatever issue had surfaced, but the car only jerked again, slower this time. I had no choice but to ease onto the shoulder of the road, the engine sighing in defeat as I shifted into park. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half hoping and half dreading that the car behind would simply drive past. But it didn't. It slowed down too, gliding to a stop several meters back. My pulse spiked again, thumping against my temples as I realized they weren't about to leave me alone. The car sat there, headlights on, casting a pale, unsettling glow over the road. I could feel their eyes on me, an invisible weight pressing down, watching every move. Time seemed to stretch out, each second thick with a silence that I couldn't break, that I didn't want to break. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I didn't dare open it. The car just sat there, motionless, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me. I kept my eyes fixed on it, hoping, praying it would just leave. But nothing happened. It was as though we were locked in a standoff, each waiting for the other to make a move. My breaths were shallow, my chest tight, the world outside shrinking to that small space between us, filled with tension so thick I could barely breathe. I don't know how long we sat there, neither of us moving, just existing in this terrible stillness. I counted the seconds, watched the glow of the dashboard lights, felt the grip of fear tightening with every passing moment. I couldn't take my eyes off that car, terrified that if I looked away for even a second, something terrible would happen. The headlights from the car illuminated the road, casting shadows that seemed to flicker with each breath of wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being toyed with, that whoever was behind that wheel was enjoying this somehow, feeding off my fear. I could feel myself unraveling, thoughts spiraling in every direction, trying to make sense of something that had no explanation. The urge to leave, to flee, grew stronger, but my body felt frozen in place, glued to the seat by an invisible force that kept me there, waiting, helpless. Then, as if the moment had passed, the car began to move. The headlights dimmed slightly as it pulled back, slow and deliberate, as if savoring its retreat. I watched, frozen, as it rolled away, merging back onto the road, taking its place in the line of cars ahead and disappearing into the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tainted, mixed with the lingering terror that still clung to me, refusing to let go. The emptiness it left behind was almost worse, like a hole I couldn't fill, a question that would never have an answer. As the silence settled, the reality of my situation hit me. I was stranded, alone on the side of an empty road, the darkness pressing in, the fear still fresh and raw. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, fingers fumbling over the screen as I searched for the one person I could call. I dialed my friend's number, barely able to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. Every detail spilled out in a rush, my words coming faster than my thoughts, the fear woven into every sentence. My friend's voice on the other end was grounding, a lifeline pulling me back from the edge of panic. They promised to come and get me, told me to stay put, to keep calm, but the reassurance was faint, barely reaching through the wall of terror that surrounded me. I kept glancing back at the road, half expecting to see those headlights return, to feel that same presence lingering just out of reach. The night felt darker now, the silence louder, pressing down with a weight that left me feeling small and vulnerable, trapped in a space that felt more like a cage than a car. The minutes stretched on as I waited, every sound amplified, every shadow a threat. My friend's car would take time to get here, but I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. I replayed the events in my mind, trying to piece together some kind of explanation, but nothing made sense. Was it a prank? A stranger's twisted idea of fun? Or something darker, a threat that I couldn't understand? The questions circled, each one digging deeper, refusing to leave me in peace. As headlights finally appeared in the distance, I felt a rush of relief, tempered by the lingering unease that refused to let go. It started like any other evening, a humdrum end to an uneventful day. I was in the middle of cleaning up the kitchen when my phone vibrated on the counter. Expecting a routine notification, I glanced at the screen, but the message I read made me pause. It was from an unknown number, a brief, cryptic line of text. "We know where you are. Better stay quiet." At first, I felt nothing more than mild confusion. It had to be a wrong number, I figured, but something about the message's tone kept me standing there, reading it over again. It was unsettlingly vague, and yet chilling. The words "we know where you are" echoed in my mind longer than I cared to admit. I brushed it off as a prank and continued with my evening. But that night, as I lay in bed, those words lingered, refusing to be dismissed. The text replayed in my mind, even as I drifted into a light, restless sleep. I told myself not to overthink it, that it was nothing, just a random mistake. But even in the dark silence of my bedroom, I felt an odd sensation, something subtle but menacing, creeping in around the edges of my comfort. The next morning, I'd nearly convinced myself to laugh it off. People received odd texts all the time, didn't they? But by afternoon, another message arrived. This time, there was no question about it. This wasn't a mistake. The message read, "You really think we don't see you?" My pulse quickened as I read the words, a cold feeling settling in my stomach. There was no logical way a stranger could know who I was, or, worse, where I was. I tried not to let it show, but paranoia began gnawing at me. I avoided glancing at my phone, afraid to see more, yet my curiosity kept pushing me to check again and again, and the messages kept coming. Over the next 2 days, I received at least 3 more, each one more disturbing than the last. Details slipped into the texts, little hints that made it feel as if they were watching my every move. I would read something like, "Nice neighborhood, isn't it?" and feel an icy dread wrap itself around my thoughts. Who were they? Why were they sending this? And how did they know about my life? It became impossible to dismiss the sense of violation. I was being targeted, no longer some anonymous recipient. Every hour I waited, expecting another message, another blow to what little peace I had left. Every glance over my shoulder, every unfamiliar face I saw, became a source of dread. By the end of the week, curiosity finally got the best of me. I knew I shouldn't engage, but I was desperate to find out who was behind this. With a shaky hand, I typed a response. "Who are you? Why are you sending me these messages?" I stared at the screen, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, half hoping and half dreading a reply. The response was immediate. Just one line. "Don't think you're safe just because you're asking questions." It felt like a slap. The words held a sinister weight, almost as if they knew I was trying to fight back, to understand. I was reeling, and a sickening fear began to churn inside me. I had provoked them, and now they weren't just sending random threats. They were warning me. A wave of panic settled in. I hadn't taken the messages seriously before, but now the reality of the situation sank in with chilling clarity. These messages weren't meant for someone else. They were for me. I spent the rest of the day feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I knew I had to do something, but what? Each time my phone buzzed, I felt an instinctive urge to throw it across the room. Every word, every phrase they sent felt like a trap tightening around me. Finally, I couldn't bear it any longer. I gathered my phone and went to the police station, hoping they could do something to stop this. I remember sitting in that cold, sterile waiting room, clutching my phone as if it might explode. I was called into an interview room where a couple of officers sat across from me. I explained everything. The messages, the threats, the details that felt like they were tearing holes in my privacy. I handed over my phone, and the officers' expressions shifted as they read each line, the tension in their faces mirroring my own. They told me they'd take it seriously, that they'd look into it and trace the sender. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. I left the station with the faint hope that someone would put an end to this nightmare. But even then, as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. In the days that followed, the silence from my phone should have been a relief, but it only fed my unease. The absence of messages felt as oppressive as the threats themselves. I couldn't stop checking my phone, waiting for an update from the police, half expecting another message to appear at any moment. The quiet was a taunt, a reminder of how exposed I felt. The police had assured me they'd be in touch as soon as they found anything, but each day that passed without word only deepened my paranoia. I began to alter my routines, avoiding familiar paths, switching up the time I left the house. But even these precautions felt hollow. Every stranger's glance felt prolonged, suspicious. I could feel my nerves unraveling, a part of me always on edge, waiting for something, anything to happen. Every shadow cast by streetlights, every noise in the dark, seemed to mock the thin layer of safety I'd tried to build around myself. I couldn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to worry my friends, and I didn't think they'd understand. This fear was something only I could feel, an isolation that kept growing, wrapping tighter around me with every silent night. Then finally, the police called. I rushed to the station, feeling a mix of dread and anticipation. An officer led me into a small room and sat me down. His face was grim, and he didn't waste time. They had traced the messages to a burner phone, he said, one tied to a known criminal. The name barely registered at first, but when the officer mentioned his background, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just some prankster or petty thug. This man had a reputation, a history of threatening and intimidating people who stumbled too close to his path. People connected to his cases had received similar threats, warnings that often escalated if ignored. The officer's words blurred as I tried to process it all. I was just an ordinary person. I hadn't done anything to deserve this. It felt like a nightmare, unwittingly entangled in the life of someone dangerous, someone whose threats were more than just words. My mind raced, replaying every message, every threat, the relentless sense of being watched. There was no mistaking it now. I had stumbled into something far more real than I had ever feared. After that revelation, my life became a fog of constant fear. I found myself looking out of the window, searching for signs of someone lurking around, doubting everyone I met. Everywhere I went seemed tainted with paranoia. Every routine was overshadowed by the looming presence of a faceless threat. I hadn't heard from the sender for days, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was still being watched. Even my own reflection became a reminder of my vulnerability. I felt like a stranger to myself, a person shaped by fear, unrecognizable in the fragments of my once normal life. The feeling of exposure was a weight pressing down on me, a constant reminder that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence itself had become a message, an ominous countdown ticking away in my mind. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside or saw shadows lingering longer than they should. I turned my head back, but found nothing, the disquieting emptiness amplifying my fear. My own home, my own space, was now a prison of anxiety. Time went by, and I saw that moving on was the only way forward. It started out as a kind of odd fascination, a curious routine that pulled us to the cemetery just as dusk settled over the town. For Hugo, Adam, and me, the cemetery wasn't a place of sadness or fear. We found a strange kind of peace there. Something about the quiet way the sun dipped behind the gravestones, leaving long, stretched shadows across the moss-covered paths. We didn't speak much on these visits. We simply walked together, letting the silence breathe around us. Each stone told its own story, whispers of people we'd never know, and somehow that silence felt like respect. We weren't the only visitors, though. Every so often we'd notice someone, a lone figure standing in the distance, often hidden among the gravestones. I had glimpsed them more than a few times, standing motionless, watching as we wandered past. They never moved, never approached, and it felt easy to believe they were just another visitor lost in their own thoughts. We didn't think much of it, just part of the scenery, another silent figure among the stones. We had no reason to question it. But looking back, I realized that figure was always there, every time we visited. A part of me wonders if the cemetery itself would feel different without them, less familiar in some strange way. We'd made a habit of walking those grounds without fear, and on that night, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, we had no idea our ritual would be shattered. On this particular evening, as we meandered along the path, I noticed the figure again. But this time, they weren't at a distance. Instead, they were closer, much closer than usual, standing rigidly between two large stones. There was something unnatural in the way they stood. No slight shift, no subtle sway of weight that you'd expect from anyone. Just a fixed posture, their gaze locked in our direction, as if they'd been waiting for us. A chill prickled along my skin, something instinctual that told me to look away, to not acknowledge them. But I couldn't resist. My eyes kept darting back to that shadowed figure. Hugo and Adam had noticed too. I could see it in their glances, the way their smiles faded into uneasy expressions. We all felt it, the tension, the way the figure's presence pressed in on us, quiet and oppressive. "Lydia, we should go," I heard Hugo mutter, his voice lower than usual. Adam nodded, his face drawn and serious. It wasn't like us to leave so suddenly, but a gnawing sense of foreboding had taken root. Without a word, we turned back toward the gate, a silent agreement passing between us. The figure remained where it stood, unyielding, and yet I felt its gaze following us, like an invisible tether pulling at our backs. As we left the cemetery grounds, the silence broke. Footsteps echoed behind us, soft at first, almost delicate, as if someone was merely strolling along. But each step was distinct, unsettlingly close, following in our path. I threw a glance over my shoulder, and there it was, the figure, still at a distance but moving toward us, relentless in its pace. At first it moved slowly, the same calm stride we'd seen in visitors before. But as we quickened our steps, the figure began to pick up its own pace, closing the distance with an unsettling ease. Fear began to coil in my stomach, spreading coldly through my veins. This wasn't normal. No one should have been able to keep up with us so steadily, so methodically. The footsteps grew louder, unhurried yet persistent, as though they knew we had nowhere to hide. I felt panic swelling within me, each beat of my heart echoing in my ears. We turned from a brisk walk into a frantic jog, not daring to look back again. I could feel Hugo and Adam's own fear mirroring mine, a shared understanding that this wasn't a game, wasn't some thrill-seeker trying to spook us. This was something different, something wrong. Our jog turned into a desperate run, a sprint down the darkening path that led toward Hugo's house. I could hear Adam's breath quickening beside me, Hugo's heavy footsteps pounding on the ground as we pushed ourselves harder. The footsteps behind us didn't falter, didn't miss a beat. They remained steady, as if the figure was floating just inches from the ground, unwavering and silent save for those echoing steps. The moment we reached Hugo's front porch, he fumbled for his keys, fingers shaking as he unlocked the door. We barely made it inside, slamming the door behind us, hearts racing in sync, each beat pounding against our chests. The silence inside the house felt oppressive, stifling, as if the very air had grown heavier in the safety of closed walls. We stood by the window, peering out into the street, our eyes darting back and forth, scanning the shadows. The figure was nowhere to be seen. The street lay empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, unremarkable in every way. But even as we searched for signs of movement, a part of me knew, felt, deep down, that we weren't truly alone. Something had followed us, something we couldn't see but could still sense, lingering, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. None of us could. We sat in Hugo's dimly lit living room, the faint hum of the streetlights outside casting shadows across the walls. None of us spoke at first. We just sat there, catching our breaths, trying to understand what had just happened. Every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the hum of a distant car. Yet none of it could drown out the racing of my heart. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the figure's silhouette against the glass. The thought sent chills through me, but I couldn't look away. Hugo finally broke the silence. What was that?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the question hung in the air, thick with dread. We had no answers. I didn't know what that figure was, why it had followed us, or why I still felt its presence, even here inside Hugo's house. Adam shook his head, his face pale, haunted. He looked as though he'd seen something worse than any of us had noticed. But as the minutes passed, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. We kept telling ourselves it was just paranoia, that we were safe behind these walls, that nothing could get to us here. But deep down, each of us felt it, an inexplicable pull, a pressure just outside, as if the figure hadn't left but had merely settled in, watching us from an invisible perch. We tried to ignore it, tried to laugh it off, but that sense of dread refused to let go. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the silence inside the house heavy and suffocating. The three of us were huddled together, barely speaking, lost in our thoughts. And then a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the house. The sound was so loud, so precise that we froze, each of us turning toward the front door in horror. It felt like my veins had turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, praying that it was just a trick of my mind. But then it came again, a steady, deliberate knock. The three of us sat rigid, barely daring to breathe. Hugo's eyes were wide with fear as he glanced at us, a silent question written across his face. No one wanted to answer. No one wanted to go near that door. My legs felt as if they were rooted to the ground, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. But Hugo, as though compelled by something outside of himself, slowly rose, creeping toward the door, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He leaned toward the peephole, peering through it with a mixture of dread and hope. After a long, tense silence, he turned back to us, his face as pale as death. There's no one there," he whispered. And yet, the fear in his eyes told me he had seen something he wasn't ready to share. The knocking stopped after that, leaving behind a silence that felt almost tangible, pressing in on us like a weight. But the fear remained, coiling tighter within me as the minutes dragged by. The house felt colder, the air heavier, as if an unseen presence had slipped in with us, lurking just beyond our sight. We tried to act normal, to reassure ourselves that we were safe, but each glance toward the windows only reinforced the dread that something was watching, waiting. I began to notice little things, the way the shadows seemed to deepen in the corners of the room, the way the lights flickered as though disturbed by a hidden force. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, drawing us toward an inevitable end. Adam sat stiffly beside me, his eyes darting around, unable to settle. Hugo paced the room, casting furtive glances toward the door, the windows, as though expecting the figure to burst through at any moment. But the figure never appeared. Instead, we were left with this endless vigil, trapped by our own fear, each of us too scared to leave, yet terrified to stay. We huddled together, whispering reassurances that none of us truly believed. I could feel my own courage slipping away, frayed by the weight of this silent, unseen horror that lingered just beyond our reach. Morning finally arrived, casting a cold, gray light through the windows. I expected to feel relief at seeing the dawn that soon came, and I was able to return to my house a little calmer. The message arrived on a gray, unassuming Tuesday. As I sat at my desk, mindlessly scrolling through emails, an unfamiliar name appeared in my inbox. It was from someone claiming to be a distant cousin, from a branch of the family I'd never heard of. He introduced himself in a way that felt oddly familiar, using nicknames only close relatives had for each other. Reading the message, a curious warmth settled over me, as if I'd stumbled upon a family connection that had slipped through the cracks. He knew details about our family that most outsiders wouldn't. He mentioned small, nostalgic things, the childhood house with the peeling blue shutters, the way my mother always burnt the edges of the holiday ham just slightly, and the family dog we'd had years ago, one I'd forgotten until now. The details brought a strange comfort, almost as if a piece of my past I didn't even know was missing had just fallen into place. But the familiarity also felt slightly intrusive, like he had seen parts of my life he shouldn't have. As I read on, his words seemed carefully chosen, like he wanted to assure me he was no stranger. He talked about wanting to reconnect and catch up on family stories. He was passing through my area and thought it would be nice to meet. I read the email again, a creeping unease stirring. I hadn't heard about any distant cousin moving around nearby, and I couldn't recall my parents mentioning anyone by his name. It felt like a mistake, some unusual coincidence, but the details he shared were too precise. As the hours passed, I began to consider the possibility. Maybe he was real. Maybe there was a connection I didn't know about. And curiosity, that strange urge to untangle the unknown, pushed me to reply. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, a place I frequented for its calm ambiance and distance from the busy streets. I arrived early, settling into a seat in the far corner, facing the door. There was an anxiety I couldn't shake, a lingering doubt I kept brushing away. But when he walked in, I saw something vaguely familiar in him, something I couldn't place. He waved with a slight, easy smile and walked over with the casualness of an old friend. As we exchanged pleasantries, he launched into a conversation about family, recalling events and stories I hadn't thought about in years. He laughed about the time my uncle accidentally spilled wine all over the Thanksgiving table, or the time we all crammed into my grandparents' tiny car for a beach trip, half of us seated on each other's laps. I nodded along, unsettled by how he seemed to know these memories as well as I did, if not better. Then he began to ask about my life, my routine, my work. His questions were probing yet gentle, and as he spoke, I noticed an intensity behind his gaze. It was the look of someone studying, cataloging every answer. I began to feel exposed, as if my answers were laying my life bare. For a moment I felt foolish for letting him in so easily. As we parted ways, he shook my hand with a firm grip and said, "It's good to have family nearby." I watched him walk away, disappearing into the crowd, his presence lingering like a faint but unsettling echo. I decided I would ask my family about him the next chance I got. The next weekend I visited my parents, taking the opportunity to casually bring up the stranger's name in conversation. I asked if they remembered any relative by that name, mentioning he seemed to know a lot about the family. My mom gave me a puzzled look, shaking her head. "No, I don't think so," she said, exchanging glances with my father, who looked equally baffled. They shared stories of distant relatives, some familiar names cropping up, but none matching his. That evening, alone in my apartment, I combed through old family records, photographs, anything that might give a hint of his existence. But there was nothing, not a single photo, a name, or a mention that connected him to us. The more I looked, the more my suspicion grew. How could someone know so much about our lives, and yet leave no trace? I considered the possibility he was some distant friend or acquaintance, someone who had somehow wormed his way into our family memories. But why? What was he after? I went to bed that night with a lingering sense of unease, feeling as if I'd invited a shadow into my life. The familiar feeling of comfort that family usually provided was now tainted by a new, unsettling fear that something was off. Something I couldn't see, but could sense creeping around the edges of my thoughts. Over the next few weeks, I heard from him again. Another message, this time with even more detailed memories. He talked about things that felt almost painfully specific. The way my grandmother used to wear a single gold bracelet every day. The secret hiding spot in the attic where we used to stash candy as kids. Each detail felt like a jolt, reopening old memories I hadn't visited in years. The strangeness of it all had grown, and yet I couldn't ignore the connection he seemed to share with our family, even if it was one-sided. I started to feel watched, as though he knew more than he should. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning crowds for his face, though I hadn't seen him since our first meeting. Part of me wanted to confront him, demand answers, but a stronger part wanted nothing more to do with him. Finally, after another message arrived, asking to meet again, I decided to put an end to it. I replied, agreeing to meet, but this time I was ready to demand an explanation, to cut through whatever game he was playing. His response was immediate, almost eager, like he'd been waiting for me to finally confront him. That eagerness unsettled me even more. The cafe felt colder, emptier this time. I arrived prepared, rehearsing in my mind exactly what I would say, steeling myself for whatever explanation he might give. When he entered, his expression was different, more calculated, as if he, too, was expecting something from me. As he sat down across from me, I launched into the questions I'd been holding back. Who was he, really? How did he know so much? And why hadn't anyone in the family heard of him? His face remained calm, but his eyes flashed with something dark, something I couldn't place. "Family can be funny that way," he said, his tone cold, almost dismissive. He claimed to have been close with relatives who had passed before I was born, though his stories about them were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle forced together. He gave details, but in a way that felt hollow, as if he was giving me just enough to keep me guessing. The familiarity was gone, replaced by a kind of disdain, as if he were angry that I was pushing too far. I felt a chill, a sense that something was wrong on a level I couldn't rationalize. His answers made sense but didn't feel right, like a carefully rehearsed lie. His patience was wearing thin, and his responses grew colder, sharper. At that moment, I decided I'd heard enough. I told him I was done, that I didn't want to see him again, and I walked away without looking back, feeling his eyes bore into me as I left. That night, the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. Every creak of my apartment felt louder, every shadow stretched a little longer, and I found myself checking the locks multiple times. I tried to shake the tension, telling myself that it was over, that he'd gotten the message. But as the clock neared midnight, a sharp knock echoed through the empty rooms. My heart raced, each beat echoing louder than the last. The knock came again, slow and deliberate, as if daring me to answer. I moved to the door quietly, peering through the peephole, and felt a wave of dread settle over me. It was him, standing there in the dim glow of the hallway light, his face hidden in shadow but unmistakable. His eyes scanned the door, waiting, as though he could sense me standing there. I held my breath, willing him to leave, but he didn't move. Instead, he raised a hand and knocked again, louder this time, his face twisting with an expression I could only describe as contempt. I told him through the door to go away, to leave me alone and never come back. The silence that followed was thick, stretching long enough that I thought he might be gone. But then he laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You think it's that easy?" he muttered, his voice muffled but clear. "You don't just get rid of family." For what felt like an eternity, he stayed outside my door, his voice dropping to an angry hiss as he hurled curses and threats I couldn't fully make out. Each word struck like a blow, each promise darker than the last. I felt trapped, my own home turned into a prison by his presence. I pressed myself against the wall, praying he'd get tired, praying he'd leave, but his words grew harsher, more unhinged. He spoke of things I'd long forgotten, moments from my past that no stranger could have known, yet he recounted them with unsettling accuracy. Finally, after what felt like hours, the pounding on the door stopped. I heard his footsteps recede, his voice fading into the night as he muttered something I couldn't quite catch. I waited, still as a statue, afraid to move, until I was certain he was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating, and it took every ounce of willpower I had to finally move, to lock the door with an extra bolt. I stayed awake the rest of the night, ears straining for any sign of his return. The following days passed in a haze of paranoia. I checked my windows constantly, kept my curtains drawn, and jumped at every sound that echoed through the walls. I called family members, asking if they'd heard from him, if he'd reached out, but no one knew a thing. It was as if he had vanished completely, leaving only a trail of unease in his wake. It started out like any other night, just me and the pavement under the dim glow of streetlights. My route was simple, a long stretch of road that cut through a quiet part of town, bordered by empty lots and the occasional rundown building. There was something comforting about the silence, the lack of people, the predictable rhythm of my own footsteps echoing against the stillness. This stretch had become my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind and let the day's stress melt away. But then I saw them. At first, it was just a figure, barely visible at the edge of the shadows, standing on the far side of the road near an old lamppost. They were cloaked in darkness, their features obscured by the night, but something about their stance caught my attention. They stood motionless, as if they'd been waiting, their gaze fixed in my direction. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just someone enjoying the night air, maybe waiting for a friend or a ride. Yet as I passed, I felt an odd prickling sensation, a quiet unease that clung to me long after I'd left them behind. The next night, I saw them again, standing in the exact same spot. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there, silent and watchful. My jog carried me past, but my mind lingered on the figure, replaying the sight over and over. The quietness of the road, which once felt like freedom, began to take on a different tone, a slight heaviness, as if the silence was something I wasn't meant to notice. Night after night, the figure was there. It became routine, their silhouette etched into the dim glow of the street, like a strange part of the landscape that I couldn't ignore. Sometimes I tried not to look, keeping my gaze fixed on the road ahead, focusing on my breathing, on the rhythmic pounding of my shoes against the pavement. But every time I approached that stretch, my eyes would wander, drawn by the persistent shadow on the edge of my vision. No matter how much I told myself it didn't matter, that it was harmless, the unease gnawed at me, growing each time I passed. Their presence was like an itch at the back of my mind, a subtle but insistent discomfort that made each jog feel less like a release and more like a chore. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, ears tuned to every stray noise, every distant rustle. The world around me seemed to shrink, the road and the figure my only focus, the silence pressing in like a weight. One night, I debated taking a different route, but there was a stubbornness in me, a feeling that changing my routine would somehow be giving in, letting the fear win. So I kept to my path, pushing down the discomfort, convincing myself it was irrational. Still, as I approached the spot, my pace quickened, my steps becoming lighter, my movements more controlled. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know if they were still there. That night, something was different. As I jogged past, I could feel their gaze. It wasn't just passive observation anymore, but something sharper, almost tangible. It settled on me, pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake off. I told myself to ignore it, to keep moving, but my body reacted instinctively, my pace quickening, a nervous energy prickling under my skin. It was as if every cell in my body was telling me to move faster, to put distance between myself and that spot. The sensation lingered, clinging to me even as I rounded a corner and left them behind. But the memory of that gaze, its intensity, the way it seemed to follow me, stayed, a stain in the back of my mind that refused to fade. There was no logical reason for it, no evidence of harm, yet the feeling gnawed at me, deeper than before. I began to question if I was imagining things, if the fear was all in my head. But each time I tried to rationalize it away, that lingering gaze came back, vivid and unyielding, and with it, the uneasy realization that maybe the figure wasn't just standing there by chance. Maybe they were waiting. The thought was absurd, paranoid, but once it took hold, it wouldn't let go. The next night, I almost didn't go. I stared at my running shoes, feeling a knot of dread twisting in my stomach. But habit, or maybe a sense of defiance, got the better of me. I told myself it was just another run, just another night. I could handle it. But as I approached that familiar stretch of road, my heart pounded harder than usual, the muscles in my legs tensing instinctively. The figure was there as expected, but this time, something felt more wrong than usual. My eyes met theirs, and for a split second, everything seemed to stop. Then, as I began to jog past, they moved. At first, it was a slow, deliberate step, and then another. My mind barely registered the shift before my body reacted, propelling me forward with a surge of speed. My legs pumped harder, my breaths coming faster, the world around me blurring as I broke into a sprint. Every few seconds I glanced back, hoping to see an empty road, but the figure was still there, closing in with a steady, unrelenting pace. Panic flared, sharp and insistent, urging me to zigzag through alleys and side streets, weaving through the maze of shadows in a desperate attempt to lose them. Each turn felt like a gamble, each step driven by the hope that they would disappear, that I could shake them off. But no matter where I went, every time I looked back, they were there, always keeping pace, a dark silhouette that felt more like a shadow than a person. The world around me had shrunk to the sound of my own breath, ragged and heavy, and the relentless thud of my feet against the pavement. Every corner I turned felt like a lifeline, a desperate attempt to shake them off. Yet no matter how fast I ran or how sharply I turned, the figure remained, closing in with a methodical persistence that defied reason. They weren't sprinting, just jogging, at a pace that was somehow enough to keep up with me, no matter how hard I tried to outpace them. My muscles burned, my lungs aching with each gulp of air, and still, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was running on pure fear, my mind racing through every possible escape, every path I could take. The streets had grown darker, the streetlights spaced too far apart, leaving me in long stretches of shadow that made it harder to see where I was going. But the darkness didn't seem to slow them down. If anything, they thrived in it, their form blending into the shadows, as if they were part of the night itself. In that moment, the realization hit me like a wave of ice. They weren't just following me. They were hunting me, their pace a controlled, calculated pursuit that felt more like a game than a chase. It was a taunt, a reminder that no matter how fast I ran, they could keep up. And as the seconds stretched on, my mind began to fracture, fear tightening its grip around my thoughts, suffocating any rationality. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, keep running, because stopping meant facing them, and I wasn't ready for that. I turned a final corner, my heart hammering as I caught sight of a row of dumpsters lined up against the wall of an alley. Without thinking, I ducked behind them, pressing myself against the cold metal, my breath shallow and fast, desperate to keep quiet. My entire body tensed, every muscle coiled in fear as I waited, listening to the night. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart, so loud it drowned out everything else. The seconds crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last, my mind racing with the possibility that any moment they'd round the corner and find me there, trapped and defenseless. And then I heard it, the soft, measured footsteps approaching. They were slow, deliberate, as if they knew I was there, waiting. I held my breath, pressing myself harder against the wall, every nerve in my body screaming for silence. The footsteps grew louder, the tension tightening like a vice around my chest, until it felt like I was suffocating, the fear so thick it was nearly tangible. But then, just as suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the alley, heavy and absolute. And for a moment, I wondered if they were standing there, just on the other side of the dumpster, waiting for me to make a move. My hand clamped over my mouth, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to disappear. After a few agonizing moments, the silence continued, and I dared to look around the edge, my heart racing as I scanned the empty street. They were gone, vanished, as if they'd never been there at all. I stumbled home that night, my body exhausted, yet every nerve on edge, alert to every shadow and distant sound. My once familiar neighborhood had taken on a sinister edge, each dark corner a potential hiding place, each passing figure a possible threat. The safety I once felt on those quiet streets was gone, replaced by a gnawing paranoia that clung to me long after I'd locked myself inside. I double-checked every lock, every window, sealing myself inside with a desperation I couldn't quite explain. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the chase over and over, the figures' relentless steps, the silent, calculating way they'd pursued me. I told myself it was over, that they'd disappeared, but the feeling wouldn't leave, the sense that somewhere out there they were still watching, waiting for another chance. Each night, as darkness fell, I found myself glancing out the window, scanning the street, searching for that familiar shadow, half expecting to see them standing there, waiting for me to venture out again. The days passed, but the fear lingered, a constant shadow that twisted even the simplest routines into acts of caution. I no longer jogged, no longer trusted the safety of the familiar roads that had once been my escape. Instead, I stayed indoors, the thought of stepping outside filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. It started as a small, almost forgettable moment, a typical weeknight as I scrolled through my phone, half-heartedly browsing and vaguely searching for ways to improve my productivity. Life had felt a little chaotic lately, my days blurring together in a relentless loop of work, tasks, and responsibilities. When a pop-up ad for an app promising to boost productivity appeared, I barely hesitated. It was advertised as a habit tracker, a tool to set reminders and keep routines in check. Seemed simple enough. I downloaded it without a second thought. The interface was sleek, minimalistic, with bright icons and friendly prompts encouraging me to take control of my schedule. I customized a few reminders, basic things like drinking water, taking breaks, and tracking time for projects. It even had a feature that suggested productivity tips, which I found helpful in an understated way. Each day, I received notifications gently nudging me to stay on top of my goals. They felt harmless, almost like a supportive friend in the background, helping me keep things in order. For the first few days, the app functioned exactly as expected. The notifications were innocuous, simple reminders of tasks I had set, occasionally suggesting things like, take a deep breath, or time for a quick stretch. I began to rely on it, letting the app guide my day in subtle ways, giving it permissions I thought would help it function better. I didn't think twice about it. It was just an app, a harmless tool, or so I thought. A few days into using the app, something odd happened. I woke up one morning to a notification that felt different from the others. Running low on coffee, time to stock up. I stopped, blinking at the screen, feeling a strange jolt of surprise. It was true. I had run out of coffee, something I had meant to remember but hadn't set a reminder for. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a well-timed suggestion, a bit of clever coding. But it left me with a peculiar feeling, like the app knew more than it should. The following day, I got another notification as I was leaving for work. Your favorite seat by the window is free at the cafe. It was specific, eerily so. I felt my stomach tighten with a mix of surprise and unease. I hadn't shared my preferences or even my location with the app. Yet it seemed to know exactly where I went, which seat I preferred, and even the times I usually stopped by. I tried to ignore the feeling, brushing it off as a strange coincidence, though a quiet part of me started to feel uneasy. Each day, the app seemed to grow more personal, more invasive. I would get notifications nudging me to take care of things I hadn't even considered, things that felt private, details no simple app should be able to access. By the end of the week, I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the app was following me, observing my habits with a precision that felt unnatural. And yet I kept it installed, telling myself it was just part of the experience, a harmless quirk of technology. The notifications continued, becoming increasingly invasive with each passing day. One morning, as I prepared to head out, my phone buzzed with a message. Late night again? Maybe head to bed a little earlier tonight. The words made my skin prickle with discomfort. I hadn't set any notifications for sleep reminders, and I certainly hadn't told the app anything about my nighttime routine. I glanced around my empty apartment, feeling an inexplicable chill. There was no reason the app should know that I'd been staying up late, no logical explanation for how it was monitoring my sleep. The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. I opened the app's settings, scrolling through the permissions, looking for any explanation that would make sense. But everything seemed normal, unremarkable even. There were no excessive permissions, nothing that indicated the app could track me in such detail. I forced myself to relax, trying to rationalize the notifications as coincidences, maybe just algorithmic guesses. But deep down, a sense of unease had taken root, gnawing at me with each notification that popped up. Days passed, and the app grew bolder. It began sending me suggestions for routines, for restaurants I'd never visited, but that matched my tastes perfectly. It knew my preferences in eerie detail, from my morning coffee order to my choice of music on long drives. I began to dread each notification, my anxiety spiking every time my phone buzzed. I considered deleting the app, but hesitated, half convinced I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the better of me. The final straw came one night, as I was heading home after a long day. The streets were dark, the familiar route comforting in its predictability. But halfway through my walk, I decided to take a different route, feeling an impulsive need for a change of scenery. It was an insignificant decision, something I wouldn't have thought twice about. Yet as I turned the corner, my phone buzzed, lighting up with a new notification. Why did you take a different route home tonight? I stopped dead in my tracks, the message glowing ominously on my screen. My pulse quickened, a cold wave of fear washing over me. The app knew I'd changed my route. It knew, in real time, that I had veered off my usual path. The message wasn't a friendly suggestion or a productivity tip. It was a question, pointed and direct, as though someone was watching, noticing my every move. In that moment, I felt truly exposed, the realization settling in that the app was far from harmless. I deleted it immediately, fingers shaking as I forced the icon off my screen. A sense of relief washed over me, a brief reprieve from the fear that had taken hold. I turned off notifications, restarted my phone, and did everything I could to sever whatever connection had been tracking me. But as I walked the rest of the way home, the fear remained, settling deep into my bones, a haunting reminder that I wasn't as alone as I'd once believed. For a brief moment, I believed I was free. Deleting the app had felt like cutting a tether, releasing me from whatever strange presence had been watching. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, my phone buzzed, a notification, but not from any app I recognized. My breath caught as I read the message. "You can't hide that easily." Panic surged through me, cold and relentless. The app was gone, deleted from my phone, yet somehow the messages continued. I scrolled through my settings, desperate to find any trace of it, some lingering file or hidden process. But there was nothing. I checked my apps, my notifications, every setting I could think of, but the phone remained clean. And still, the messages appeared, taunting me, each one a chilling reminder that whoever was behind this wasn't letting go. Over the next few days, the notifications grew more aggressive, each one a thinly veiled threat. "Missing your morning coffee yet?" one read shortly after I decided to avoid my usual cafe. Another, "It's not polite to ignore a friend." The words unsettled me, an intrusion that reached into my daily life with an unsettling familiarity. It was as if someone were watching, tracking my every choice, every slight deviation. I became hyper-aware of everything I did, trying to stay unpredictable, to move in ways that would throw off whatever was tracking me. But it didn't work. Each notification was a reminder that my attempts to escape were futile, that no matter where I went, they'd find me. Desperate, I turned to the police. I explained everything in detail, from the app's odd notifications to the increasingly personal messages that continued even after I'd deleted it. The officer who took my statement listened carefully, his expression hardening as I recounted the unsettling events. They assured me they would look into it, that there were measures they could take to trace the app's origins. Days later, I received a call from the detective assigned to my case. He informed me that they had managed to trace the app to an anonymous server. There was no identifiable owner, no records or logs, just an empty shell, a digital ghost that led nowhere. They'd done everything they could, he explained, but the trail had run cold. The app was untraceable, designed to disappear without a trace, as if it had never existed at all. The news left me with a sinking sense of helplessness, a chilling realization that whoever was behind this was untouchable. They had built something that existed in the shadows, outside the reach of law or logic. And as I hung up the phone, a new message appeared, almost as if in response. "Nice try." Determined to escape the reach of this invisible watcher, I took drastic steps. I bought a new phone, a fresh number, every setting carefully managed for privacy. I felt a rush of relief as I powered on the new device, seeing the blank, untouched screen, free of the notifications that had haunted me. The absence of that familiar buzz gave me a fleeting sense of safety, a belief that I'd finally outrun whatever was tracking me. For days, I carried the new phone with cautious optimism, adjusting to the quiet, to the freedom of a life unobserved. I began to settle back into my routines, reclaiming the parts of my life that had been overtaken by paranoia. But one evening, as I was settling down to sleep, the phone lit up. My stomach dropped as I stared at the notification. "Did you really think you could escape me?" The words felt like a cold hand on my spine, a reminder that I could switch phones, change numbers, do everything in my power to sever the connection, but it wouldn't matter. They had found me, again. No matter how far I tried to run, they were always a step ahead, waiting for me to let my guard down. I'd cut the cord, but they'd reattached it, binding me to an unseen watcher that seemed to exist beyond any device or account. Since that night, my life has become a series of cautious steps, every movement measured, every decision clouded by the knowledge that I am never truly alone.